Hot Cuisine and Robin's other publications can be found at her website, robinbellamy.com. Robin was featured in the Canadian press junket for the film White Noise and speaks often at seminars and festivals as well as college campuses. Her experience as a radio personality in West Virginia, Ohio, and North Carolina provided with a good working knowledge of the press and easy rapport with all audiences. Please welcome Robin Bellamy.
Wow, that's a lot to live up to. Thank you. I am Robin Bellamy. Those of you who are local may know my dad, Bob Pyatt. I'm supposed to say that every time I'm in point because he thinks he's got all these friends, you know. What I'm going to talk to you today is about the UFO flap of 1966 and 1967 in the Point Pleasant and Mid-Ohio Valley area. UFOs kind of have a bad reputation. A UFO is not necessarily a flying saucer. It's anything that's unidentified. For a long time, experimental planes are thought to be UFOs, many different things like that. A flying saucer is not a UFO, it's a flying saucer. It's been identified as a flying saucer, so it's not unidentified anymore. Mothman enthusiasts and researchers have asked for some background because this is a subject that's not usually covered when you're talking about Mothman. Tomorrow I'll be talking about cryptozoology, which is another element of Mothman that some people think he might have been an animal. John Keel, however, when he did his initial research in the 60s, believed that Mothman was some kind of an alien, and then in later years believed he was intraterrestrial, meaning still of this world, but not necessarily in our time. Because they asked me to speak about UFOs this year, I've done a lot of research on this and discovered that I didn't know near as much as I thought I did. I'm pleased to tell you that I know an awful lot more now. What we're not going to talk about is belief systems. I'm not going to ask you to believe that UFOs exist. I'm not going to tell you for sure that they do or that they do not. I think that's something that every person has to decide for themselves. We're going to go over a little bit about the history of UFO sightings. The first one that we have record of is in 1500 BC. In Egypt, the pharaoh saw some foul-smelling circles, and they were fire and flying discs across the sky. In 800 BC, there was an aerial landing strip built in Peru in the Andes Mountains. There were no planes back then, obviously, so we're not sure entirely why those landing strips were built. In 329 BC, Alexander the Great saw two objects in the sky. They were diving down at his armies in war. In 90 BC, an object raised from the earth that was big enough to obscure the sun. In 80 BC, they were seen in Scotland. In 776 AD, there were two large red shields that moved over a church. In 1810, the Emperor Charlemagne saw a huge sphere travel from east to west, and he was injured because his horse got spooked and threw him off. In 1492, now this was one that I found particularly interesting. In 1492, Christopher Columbus saw a UFO appear, disappear, and move up and down about 4 hours before seeing land. That's also another one that's not widely publicized. In the 1940s, there were numerous unidentified objects over Japan and the U.S. and Italy. Some of these have been attributed to the planes of war, but others are not so easily explainable. In 1952, there was a large sighting in Argentina. Locally, the sightings began about the 1930s. The floating white light following a man and then disappearing. And a woman who lived in an area that was known for swamp gas or ghost lights, they mean the same thing, saw something red with antennas. So she knew it wasn't ghost lights. Swamp gas is something that happens when the methane mixes with the basic ground materials and kind of emits a green glowing light. In 1976, in Newcomerstown, Ohio, a man reported that his car was followed by an object. He said it was round, like two saucers put together. It had windows and lights and made no noise. And in the same town 20 years later, they had a similar sighting. In 1996, a triangle-shaped UFO flew over Ohio. In 99, Zanesville, someone saw an object rise out of the water and fly off into the sky. In Marietta, Ohio, just north of here in 2003, There were 2 triangle-shaped objects that flew over a woman's car. But the interesting thing about that is that she says they were only about 750 feet up in the air, which, if you know anything about flying, is very, very low, especially in this area. In Ross County, Ohio, also in 2003, a witness saw an object hover over his house, and it caused his dogs to bark. And 2 young teenagers got a flashlight and were signaling to the craft, and this craft flashed back in the same pattern that the kids had signaled it. The child also said that a being came out of the craft and actually reached out and touched him. In the spring of 2005, there were several objects with colored lights over Cincinnati. In September of 2005, there were over 100 people in Parkersburg, West Virginia, who saw a lighted object pass overhead. In Point Pleasant, the sightings began really in 1966. And if you guys stop by my table later, I have a list of all of the sightings. And this list was taken from Donnie and Jeff's books, as well as John Keel's book, and several local reports in the newspaper. One of the things you want to remember when you're talking about the sightings in Point Pleasant in November of 1966 and 1967 is that the Leonid meteor showers were also in the sky at the time. So some of these erratic lights may have been just meteor related. There's also an Allegheny Airlines flight that is on record that flew over Point Pleasant daily to Huntington between 8:10 and 8:50 p.m. So some of these are probably associated as well with that. One of the problems with this particular list is that John Keel didn't give people's names or their exact location to kind of protect their privacy. They didn't want people camping out in the front yard and watching for UFOs. So this is a general list of where they were seen. It includes the Point Pleasant Elementary School. Some of you who are familiar with the area know where all these things are. Every night over Camp Conley in the first 2 weeks of April in 1966, somebody saw a UFO. Saw them in Hartford and New Haven and over Tiney's. Gallipolis, Thomas Ridge, Jackson Avenue has a significant sighting. Both sides of the Cheshire, Ohio area. 30th Street, excuse me, there were a lot of people who saw UFOs in that area. Milton, Canova, Cross Lanes, Huntington, Leetart Falls. The sheriff's transmitter tower was actually taken out. They had a transmitter blow at the same time that a UFO passed over the sheriff's transmitter tower, and they weren't able to communicate. There were people seeing these things, UFOs and Mothman, and they couldn't communicate because the sheriff's tower was out. 5 Mile Creek, Madison Avenue, Gallipolis Ferry, Mary Hyer's house, Jerry's Run, Nelsonville, Ohio, Camp Conley. There's a whole list. There's 2 pages just from November of 66 to January 1st of 68, which is significant. All over the U.S. there were sightings in 66. So Point Pleasant wasn't alone, but the sheer volume of sightings in the Point Pleasant area is just overwhelming. Serious investigation about UFOs began with something called Project Sign. This was a precursor to Project Blue Book. It began December 30th, 1947. It was officially known as Special Project HT-304. It was headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Wright-Patterson is virtually a direct line from here over in Dayton, Ohio. There were numerous sightings all over the U.S. in 1947. Experts in this group, this Project Sign group, generally agreed that people were seeing something. It wasn't made up, but they tended to believe that they were Soviet experimental craft. Back then, the Soviets were the big enemy. Everybody was afraid of communism. Everybody was afraid that the Russians were smarter than us, so they blamed everything on the Soviets. They believed that the Soviets had German technology from World War II, and believed that they were flying spy planes. Now, why Russian spy planes would care anything about Point Pleasant, I don't know, but that's what they believed. Over the course of the year of the group's existence, they came to believe that the craft were actually extraterrestrial and issued a top-secret memo to that fact. However, all copies of that memo were burned, and when the public found out, that's when the rumors started about how there was a big government cover-up. Project Sign became Project Grudge in 1949. The group was formed primarily to tell people there were no such thing as aliens and no such thing as UFOs. The government appointed Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was an astronomer, to consult on the project. The public never accepted the debunking, as it's called. They always believed that the flying saucers existed. And after researcher Donald Keel began investigating and making the accusations of cover-up, Project Grudge began to fall apart. There was so much public pressure that Project Grudge was reduced to only one staff member, and he was a junior Air Force officer. But in 1952, Project Grudge became Project Blue Book, and this is probably the one that you guys are most familiar with. There was a new wave of sightings in 51 and 52, and the public demanded that somebody tell them what was going on. Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt was the first leader of Project Blue Book, and at the same time a significant sighting was made by an Air Force pilot, which kind of gave it some credibility. Dr. Hynek continued his role as a consultant with Project Blue Book, and over the course of time started to actually believe that UFOs were extraterrestrial in nature. Dr. Hynek is a very interesting person. He's also probably considered for the U.S. the most knowledgeable person for UFOs to date. He had degrees in general science and he had a doctorate in astrophysics. During World War II, he worked at Johns Hopkins on some special radio wave project for the Navy. After the war, he joined the faculty at OSU in Columbus, and he left there in '56 and joined the Smithsonian and Harvard to work on some special projects. And by 1960, he was teaching again at Northwestern University. While he was at OSU, he was contacted to work on Project Sign and then eventually Project Blue Book. And he initially believed that sightings of UFOs were reported by people who were less than sane. He thought that you had to be crazy to have seen one of these things, and that the UFO witnesses were unreliable. He thought that the folks had misidentified natural and man-made objects or were just plain crazy. He originally thought the whole study was ridiculous and couldn't understand why they wanted somebody of his caliber to come and sit in on this study. But after examining hundreds of reports through the government projects, he eventually began to believe that there really was something going on. In 1985, near the end of his life, he gave the reasons for his change of opinions, and that was first the completely negative attitude and unyielding attitude that the government had. They didn't want anything to do with UFOs, and that led Hynek to believe that maybe there was something worth paying attention to after all. And also was the caliber of the witnesses. Reports were coming in from presidents, from airline pilots, from police officers. It got to the point where you couldn't just say that all of the witnesses were crazy. That didn't fly anymore. So Hynek started to believe that maybe there was something that couldn't be so easily dismissed. In one of his best-known statements, he said, and this is a quote, "Ridicule is not part of the scientific method, and people should not be taught that it is. The steady flow of reports, often made in concert by reliable observers, raises questions of scientific obligation and responsibility." Basically, that just means that you can't tell somebody something doesn't exist because you can't prove it doesn't exist, and you shouldn't teach them to approach it from a negative angle. Later in his life, he publicly talked about his belief that UFOs were not necessarily alien spacecraft. This is now not new thinking, but back then, to say that something was from the Earth but not from our time was fairly unknown. I mean, people didn't really grasp the idea of interdimensional time travel until just in the last 10 or 15 years.